So I will, despite what Davna has said about myself, I will not talk so much about long-term monitoring on statistics, so don't run away. I will more tell a story about, comparing Arctic ecosystems on more alpine ecosystems. And I should apologize perhaps here for, I will have a very strong European bias. That's because that's the places I know best, that I feel more comfortable to talk about. And I will focus mostly on North Norway, where I work. I put you here on the map where is Tromsø, so it's 70 degrees north. And my university is called the Arctic University of Norway, even if we are not really in the Arctic in terms of vegetation. So here I put a quote from Christian, who is also there, to just remind you that often we talk about alpine tundra or Arctic tundra, and of course there is no really good reason for making the difference because it's a continuum. And just to give you an example of this continuum, and this really where I work here in the North Norway, we are exactly where the Arctic and the alpine in a way meet. And here the black line that you have on this map that is going from east to west is in fact where the forest line is at the sea level. That is in principle north of that line you are in the Arctic. And when you are south of that line, you are when you have tundra, you will be more in the alpine zone. So we can discuss the terminology, but it's just to show in a way the place where I work, where we have this long-term observatory. Where we really meet in a way these alpine and Arctic terms. But today what I want to talk about is more about what is often called this arctico-alpine species. This is species that you find in the alpine biome, more in especially for example in the European Alps, compared to the species that you can find in the Arctic, so north of the tree line. So I will focus most about Europe, but just be aware, of course, that if you think about the northern part of our globe, there are some big differences between North America and, for example, Europe. For example, in North America, you have a mountain range and the Rocky Mountains that stretch all the way to the Arctic, more or less continuously. It's not something you have in Europe, since the mountains in Fennoscandia, so in the north, there is a big gap compared to what you have in the Alps. So there are some differences, but I will gloss over them, but just be aware, of course, that you cannot generalize that easily when you start to look at this kind of thing. So I will take just as a starting point the most recent paper that was published about the evolutionary history of the Arctic flora. That was just published in Nature Communications a few weeks ago, where they show this map of the Arctic. So this black line again is this forest line. Everything north of that is in the Arctic. So here, for example, I am in Tromsø, so you have this small part which is Arctic here. And they focus on 3 species on this figure, that they say that they are representative plants of the Arctic. And they show the Saxifraga oppositifolia, so the one on the top right. It's not a very beautiful picture that they used. And then you have Ranunculus nivalis and Pedicularis hirsuta, so 3 plant species. Interestingly, Saxifraga oppositifolia is the plant that Christian found at the highest spot in the Alps on the Dome at 4,500 meters. And interesting, it's also the species which is the northernmost species in the world, because you also have it in the northernmost tip of Greenland. So it is really a species that like it cold, one can say. But then what is interesting with these 3 species is that in terms of distribution, they show very different patterns. Saxifraga oppositifolia is really arctico-alpine in the sense that you have it both in the Arctic and in the mountains, both in North America and in Europe. And for example, it's quite common in European mountains, but also in Asia. It's not just specific to Europe. Ranunculus nivalis starts to be more Arctic than alpine. So you still have it, for example, in the Scandinavian mountains. But here is the maps from GBIF. Of course, these maps are often, there are some errors. You don't have Ranunculus nivalis in the Alps. So these dots that you have represent errors. And then you have the most Arctic one in these three species that they were showing in this paper, Pedicularis hirsuta, which is mostly Arctic. And then you have a few, anyway, occurrence in the mountains, like, for example, in the Scandinavian mountains. But what I want to focus on today is something else than plants. Because when you ask people often about arctic-alpine, or if you, for example, look at Wikipedia and you type arctic-alpine, they only discuss plants. And this is quite well known. There's a lot of literature on arctic-alpine species. Here, I want to focus on other organisms, on especially vertebrates, on especially birds, on mammals. And this is what I work on most of the time. So this is what I know best. So I feel more kind of comfortable discussing these groups. So if you think about birds, a typical example of an arctico-alpine species is the rock ptarmigan. So the rock ptarmigan, as you can see on the map, you have it both in the Arctic and in mountain ranges, as you can have it in the Alps, in the Pyrenees, in Europe, but you also have it in the mountains in Japan or in North America. So this is, again, a kind of nice example of arctico-alpine. But then you start to have species that are properly alpine, like, for example, the snowfinch, that you get only in the Alps. You never get snowfinch in Arctic. On the contrary, you have the snow bunting. These two species look a bit the same. That's why I put both of them on this figure. And the snow bunting is mostly an Arctic species. You have it in the Scandinavian mountains and also a bit in the mountains in Alaska, but it doesn't go further south. So you have really this dominance of Arctic. Now, if you go a bit further about, in a way, important bird species in the Arctic, that's mostly geese and waders. So I put here some examples from the snow goose in North America, or the pink-footed goose on Svalbard or Greenland. These species are only found in the Arctic. You never have geese in the mountains in the further south. And it's the same with waders. So if you think of red knot or purple sandpipers, important species in the Arctic, you will never have them in the mountains. Okay, in this case, the explanation is rather obvious in the sense that the habitat for these species are not found in the mountains. That is, they need this kind of flat habitat with mires and wetlands and so on. And these habitats are not only very rare, or in a way, or cover only small areas further south. So in that case, explaining why you have only this Arctic species or not arctico-alpine, it can be really found in habitat, not the climate, but more the habitat. Now, if I move to mammals. So here I put a list of mammals depending on the size. If you look at large mammals, species are either Arctic or alpine. That is, if you think about typical Arctic species like the muskox or the reindeer, you don't find them further south in the mountains, except again for some specific case, like for example, the wild reindeer in Norway. But again, you have, in this case, this kind of continuity with the Arctic, but you don't have them further south, like for example, in the Rockies or in the mountains in the Alps. Same thing, the muskox is a strictly Arctic species. The large mammals that you have in the Alps or in the Rockies, they don't go in the Arctic. So for example, the chamois or ibex in the European Alps is a species that you don't get in the north. Medium-sized mammals like the hare, then you have again this kind of combination. Some species are arctico-alpine, like the mountain hare, but some species are Arctic only, like the Arctic hare in North America. Now, if you move to small mammals, you have again a situation like for the large mammals that they are either Arctic species or alpine species. So here I put a long list, but basically you have species like lemmings that are only found in the Arctic. And then you have other species in the Alps that you don't find in the Arctic. So here for mammals, I could summarize it like this. It's a very strong simplification. That is, a botanist knowing the alpine flora would be able to recognize a large part of the Arctic flora. There are very few endemic species. It's some tens of species among 2,000, so it's a very small proportion. So a botanist like Christian, even if he had never been in the Arctic, would be able to recognize really a large number of species. Now, a mammalogist or ornithologist that knowing the alpine mammals would be completely lost in the Arctic, because most of the species that you have in the Arctic are not found in the Alps. So the question is really what could explain these kind of differences. So now, when you look at documents on, for example, on the IUCN, they have this list of the red list of ecosystems trying to compare different ecosystems. For example, for the polar tundra and deserts, they write about, okay, birds, they migrate, so there is something different. But for the mammals, they say a few mammals in the northern hemisphere are hibernating residents or migratory herbivores. That's wrong. The mammals that you have in the Arctic, they are not hibernating. It's one species in North America which is hibernating, so it's really an exception. And they are not migratory. It's more the species that you have further south, more boreal species that are migratory. And species in Greenland or Svalbard and so on, they are not migratory. So they are, in fact, resident, the mammals, resident on non-migratory, on non-hibernating. Which brings me to trying to understand why you have this kind of difference between, if you think about mammals. Here I put the temperature for different stations in the Arctic and in the European Alps. So in the European Alps, you have, for example, the Grand Saint-Bernard, 2,400 meters, so above the forest line, where you have summer temperature of about 6 degrees in July, on winter temperature about -8. And that's the blue curve here. Jungfraujoch, again in the European Alps, in Switzerland again, 3,500 meters, so you have quite far above the forest line. Summer temperature about 0, on winter temperature about -12. Now, Svalbard, that's the Arctic part of Norway, the high Arctic, at least it was, high Arctic, 78 degrees north. That's the green curve. The winter temperature are the same as in Jungfraujoch, so about -12. The summer temperature are the same as in the Grand Saint-Bernard, so about 6-7 degrees. Now I put in red just to have a comparison. Another site in the Arctic, Bylot Island, is the northern part of Canada. It's 73 degrees north. The summer temperatures are the same as in Grand Saint-Bernard or Svalbard. So there's no difference in the summer temperature. But of course, the winter are much, much colder. It's nothing comparable. Average temperature in February, -35. Okay, nothing new. This has been discussed a long time, and I'm sure Christian will have comments about what this temperature means, but I just want to go a bit further. There are some big differences if you compare this climate in terms of the variability. Now, this is not something which is often stressed when one is looking at climate. Arctic climate, and it's the same for Bylot or Svalbard, have a highly variable winter temperature. Here I put the standard deviation of the monthly values. So for example, on Svalbard, when you have a standard deviation of 5, it means that from one month to the next, you can have a difference in the mean temperature of 20 degrees. It's a huge variability in winter temperature. It's a bit less on Bylot, but it's still quite high. And in the Alpine, it's much less. But in the summer, the situation is reversed. That is, in the Arctic, it's extremely stable. And in the Alpine, the same as in the winter, but it means that it is more variable than in the Arctic. So one could argue, okay, who cares about monthly averages? Because no one is, in a way, responding to monthly averages. So if you look at the daily values, which are kind of closer to what organism can experience, it is the same pattern. So it's not specific to monthly. You have the same pattern with daily temperature. For example, in the summer, so here I took the July values. In Svalbard, you have a much less variability compared to Jungfrau Joch. So if you look at, here I put the same scale, it's not the same values, but it's the same interval. The variability in daily temperature is much higher in the summer in the Alps compared to what you have in the Arctic. For example, in Svalbard, it never freezes in July. You never get below zero temperature in July. It's something you would get quite often in this kind of cold climate in the Alps. In the winter, as I said, is the reverse. That is, the variability in the daily temperature is much higher in Svalbard compared to what you have in the Alps. And here, the average is exactly the same. So one can compare it directly. The variability is a lot higher in Arctic compared to the Alps. Now you may ask, okay, who cares about variability? And that's where the kind of organism you are looking at and what kind of variability you are interested comes in. In the winter, when you are in the Arctic, you get this huge variability in winter temperature, which means that, for example, on Svalbard, you hit temperature above zero relatively often. And the consequence of this, when you are in the Arctic, is that you get this kind of effect. This is a picture taken on Svalbard, and this is something that you can see really relatively often. The whole landscape is covered with ice. And this clearly has a big impact on, for example, reindeer or lemming. Here you have a picture of a poor lemming that was walking on the fresh snow and trying to dig itself in the snow to reach the vegetation, and that just died digging in the vegetation. So clearly, this kind of effect will have a huge consequence on the herbivores, like especially mammals, but apparently much less if you look at the plants. So to conclude, when you want to compare this kind of Arctic and alpine system, when I say this, I think about Arctic, so north of the tree line, and alpine about European Alps and temperate alpine biome. Of course, you have these differences that have been described for a long time between Arctic having this kind of, they both have short summers and long winters, but the variability of the seasons is quite different. I would say at another extreme, think about the tropics, and I think Laszlo will talk about it, that when, for example, Olof Hedberg, when he was talking about the African mountains, I said this is a climate where you have summer every day and winter every night. So that's kind of the complete extreme if you go from the Arctic to temperate to the tropics. And what I want to say here is that the consequence of these differences in terms of climate and variability, they are very dependent on the group you are looking at. The plants, they don't seem to be very sensitive to what is happening in the winter. They are under the snow, even under the ice, but that doesn't seem to affect them very much. But the mammals or the resident birds, of course, that are strongly affected by this. So that's really what I think is explaining why the fauna that you have in the Arctic and more temperate Arctic alpine ecosystems is quite different, is because of the sensitivity to this winter variability, something that I think has not been really studied that much when one is looking at climate change. That was it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel.
I will stop sharing.
You stop sharing indeed, and we will right away hand over the microphone to Laszlo. And as I was saying at the beginning of this webinar, we'll take questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Daphne. Thank you, Nigel. It was fantastic, very interesting. I enjoyed it a lot. I will quickly share my screen. And then I'll start my own. Well, first of all, rapidly, let me say that my background is not in the Andes, not even the picture behind me. The picture behind me is from the Alps as well. And what I'm going to do today is tell you about the Andes in its mountain and alpine environments. Mountain and alpine, because alpine, as very clearly was put by Nigel, really only in the Arctic, where you don't have to have an elevation gradient, a forest line going up a mountain. You find it already at sea level. So we can't really talk about alpine in most of the mountains without talking about the mountain as well. What I'm going to do today, in somewhat changing the usual pattern, I'm going to start saying something about the humans in the Andes, then a bit about the origin and how the Andes came about, and what it means for the biota and the biogeographic connections, the implications of the Andes being where it is or where they are for climate, and then some slides about biodiversity, and then I wrap up. Okay, so why do I start with the humans in the Andes? Because what we see today in the Andes, when we go into the alpine, we're actually not sure what we see is alpine or not alpine. Why is that? Let's go back to Heinz Allenberg. What he said in his second Tanzi lecture in 1977 at the BES. He said the following: in order to study real nature, many ecologists get away from Europe. This was also my reason why I first traveled to Peru and other tropical countries. After several months of fieldwork, however, I could not fail to discover traces of man's impact there too. Human influence became apparent also in the most remote highlands and in the lonely dry valleys of the Pacific slopes. I couldn't agree more with Ellenberg. In fact, I think that he very gently, grossly understated seeing the impact, the traces of impacts in the Andes, for example. We're in the central Andes here. Looking at this landscape, we could be anywhere heavily grazed parts of the Scottish Highlands. What we see here, llamas, alpaca grazing, very shortly clipped sward here. I would like to draw your attention to these dark patches in sheltered parts of the landscape. These are planted potato. Normally, one would expect in sheltered places like this, shrubby and forest patches growing, which, in fact, is the case when we look closely. And in places, we find places where grazers cannot get to. And there was a recent study, very elegantly comparing these inaccessible ledges with the surrounding environment, which are accessible to grazers, in this case, sheep, and clearly showing that in these areas, up to 4,700, 800 meters, we would expect at least partially open polylepis forest to observe. So therefore, what we see, and when we get to Central Andes, with no trees at all, we have a difficulty in placing our tree line. Tree line is important because this is the line that separates the alpine from the montane forest. This is not only the case in the Central Andes. The same goes for the Northern Andes, where we can see various vegetation types arranged according to temperature and precipitation by Monasterio back in 1980 in the Venezuelan Andes, and showing how humans been utilizing these various vegetation types, how they converted it into human land use, and that goes for the tree line ecotone and the high alpine, high paramos in Venezuela as well. Okay, I find it very important to deal with this at the very beginning, so that when I get to the end of the talk, I can link it to my conclusions. Okay, but now let's jump back in time and let's see where the Andes come from really. What we have here is Earth history. Around about 100 million years ago, separated South America from Africa, and South America started slowly drifting to the west. Okay. Basically, at that point, 100 million years ago, we can put the beginning of the uplift of the Andes. However, when really it took off in an unequal manner along the length of the continent, it was about 35 million years ago. Now, this is an important thing, that the tectonics that has also, for the origins and the biogeographic connections of the biota. Okay, so what happens? Again, we have the separation of Africa from South America from Africa 100 million years ago. There's another important separation of continents, breaking up Gondwana, when Antarctica, Australia, and other bits separate from the southern part of South America, which clearly identifies Southern South America is a different biogeographic entity. There is another issue, a recent connection with North America and between North America and South America. And outstanding importance is the Andean origin. Okay, and for the biota, this obviously means that there is shared elements on the continent, especially on what today we call Brazil. In the mountains of Brazil, there is the southern connection, which is which links southern part from the Mediterranean from 30 south all the way to 55 south with other continents. There is the interchange of flora fauna between North America and South America. An example is quercus species in the montane forest of Colombia, almost reaching northwest Argentina. And obviously, the fundamental is the Andes as a central speciation, being a formidable barrier, biogeographical barrier, but in the meantime, obviously, along its 8,000 kilometers as a dispersal route. Okay. More recently, in this case, in the last 2.6 million years, the various alternation of glacial interglacial cycles has contributed diversification in the Andes as well, by splitting up populations of living organisms and then throwing them together again. Okay, so we have the result, which was very nicely summed up 4 plants recently in a recent publication, which used nearly 30,000 species identified in the Andes, in the range of from 100 to above 4,000 meters, showing a latitudinal trend whereby in the northern Andes is the highest the diversity. The most diverse ecosystem being in the northern Andes the cloud forest. Second after it is the Andean sister ecosystem, the Andean montane forest. As far as the alpine formations are concerned, there is a good, strong connection between a paramo, that is the alpine of the northern Andes, with the montane forest. Equally, there is a reasonably good connection between the Puna, which is far drier than the paramo, with the montane forest of central Andes. On the other hand, the flora of the southern part of the Andes is somewhat less strongly connected to anything. Okay, now let's have a final look at this quick graph here that shows the number of taxa, families, genera, species with elevation from 100 meters to over 5,000. obviously what we see, what we expect is a strong decline of species richness for about 4,000 meters. Now, this is very good and expected. The problem is that when we deal with mountain biodiversity, we need a different kind of characterization. Altimetric data do not tell us much. So we have an enormously rich database that we would somehow need to be arranged in a way that we could interpret it in terms of whether it belongs to upper mountain, whether it belongs to the alpine. Why is it important? Because if you take an example of 2,000 meters in the south of the continent, it can certainly be in an ice field. The same 2,000 meters in the Colombian Andes will be cloud forest. So we need to define, transform these values that we have altimetric data into thermal belts, combining elevation and latitude. Okay, rapidly about the climate, mostly the macroclimate, and a little bit about the regional climate, which is caused by the presence of the Andes. As we expect, radiation, the energy received from solar radiation is highest near the equator, and it will diminish with latitude. No surprise there. Temperature will follow the same pattern. Temperature seasonality will increase, which means that growing season will decrease with latitude. We don't have the same pattern with regard to precipitation, nor latitudinally, nor with elevation. What happens with precipitation? Precipitation much depends on the global ocean and atmospheric circulation patterns. And also we have the Andes, which is a formidable barrier. By having this chain up to about 40 south over 4,000 meters. So this results in well-definable patterns. I put in an animation, but I reckon that I won't have time for this, so I'll skip this one. But who will have this presentation can click on this map and will be directed to an animation. Okay, I summarize this in the following image. We have a wet northern part of the continent. The prevailing winds come from the Atlantic, and they actually get rejuvenated the precipitation across the Amazon. However, this barrier that the Andes present will deflect all this and will direct a good part of this precipitation to the Plata in the southern part of Brazil. Importantly, the central Andes basically only gets precipitation from the Atlantic, nothing from the Pacific. Okay, so the Pacific macroslope is arid. On the other hand, in the south there is ample precipitation coming from the west, and on the other side there is a rain shadow on the Patagonian Pampa side. So this is what we have here in terms of climate, which is important to consider when we try to link it with biodiversity patterns, be it in the alpine or outside of it. So very quickly to set Fransisco up for his talk, I put in some slides here. The first thing that important for us in terms of mountain and alpine biodiversity is the tree lines. Tree lines basically that imaginary line of trees at least 3 meters tall that form patches that we can delimit mountain forest from the alpine zone. Okay. Now, this is a global phenomenon. However, what happens in the Andes, it's got ample diversity. we are in the northern hemisphere used to this pattern that we have in the south of the Andes, where we have one or two species, usually a single species. It's a notophagous species here. We have a growing season length that is just about enough for trees to grow. And snow cover is important both for the preventing the regeneration of tree species and also for habitat diversity. When we reach the central Andes, we find several species at the tree line. There is some kind of restriction of the growing season length, but there is not much. Snow there is not important at all because hardly lies. Now, when we go further north, to our surprise, to my surprise, we find about 100 species that reach the tree line. Okay, there's no growing season restriction, and obviously there is no problem with the snow lie. Now, the question arises, is this, again, really a latitudinal species richness pattern, or perhaps this richness in the northern Andes and also in the central Andes is related to what I shown you at the beginning of my talk with regard to the human interference that will have lowered the tree line. So basically, it is possible also that this high number of species that reach the tree line, in actual fact, reaching a visible line today, but not the climatically potential tree line. It is worth thinking about it and perhaps investigating it. So when we get into to see what's happening in the mountain and alpine zone, lots of individual projects. There are networks focusing on Andean mountain forests. There are people interested in the Paramo communities. They have a fantastic database. There are the alpine summit vegetation plots monitored regularly for climate change. Fransisco will talk about it. There are people interested in invasive alien species, which is a real concern in the Mediterranean part of the Andes. And there are a few long-term ecological research sites, like the one in the Merida Andes, which we recently published a special issue with. Okay. Paramo, absolutely the champion in terms of species diversity. There are various, within the Paramo, obviously we have a lot of different vegetation types related to topography, related to microclimate, related to water availability. There are interesting differences in the Paramo that in the Ecuadorian Paramo, the precipitation pattern is rather equal during the year. It's partly due to the westerlies coming from the Atlantic, Amazonia, and the local convective lifting of humid air. On the other hand, in the Paramos of Merida, there is seasonality. So again, we cannot really generalize, not even in the humid Paramo. Okay, going further south, we have the so-called Puna. It's a high mountain alpine vegetation where the precipitation is considerably lower and it diminishes with the latitude. Various vegetation types can be seen. Desert Puna here with the sparse shrubs. There is an azonal flush here, flushed wetland. Even further to the south, from about 30 to 36 south, we have the Mediterranean alpine. There is an interesting article that should be coming out that I discovered this morning, where a group from Santiago looked at the drivers of a distribution of species in the Mediterranean alpine. What was very surprising for me that the ranking of these species shows that 2 out of the 3 species that occur at the highest elevations are introduced European invasive species. Okay. Right, I'm running out of time, so just very quickly I'll sum up what we know about biodiversity, about the tree line. Genetic level, there is considerable study-specific information. However, it's missing to be cataloged in a unique and unified database. Taxonomic level, aquatic biodiversity, be it plants or animals, it's very well known, especially in the tropical Andes, especially in the central Andes. Basically, next to nothing is known about soil biodiversity. Regarding animals, a lot of the there are some groups very well studied, for example, anurans, because of the extinction threat that many anurans face in the Andes. Plants are well studied, but the accounts usually based on country or regional basis. Ecosystems, again, well studied, well known. The problem, what I see, is that few studies concentrate on structure and function. Okay, so I'll wrap up now in terms of what do we do with all this information? We have a rich source of information, but as I pointed out earlier, it's collected and cataloged in a way that it's very difficult to put everything together so we can make an integrated assessment. Global Mountain Biodiversity Assessment is planning to do a Global Mountain Biodiversity Assessment. Now, for this, I think this is a very good moment for instigating an Andes-wide deep assessment of alpine and upper mountain biodiversity. For this, we need unified databases of existing data to be able to make syntheses, and obviously also to identify gaps. As I said before and emphasize again, all the occurrence information about species, be it plants or any other type of organism, we need to organize it in thermal belts as opposed to the altimetric values that are associated with most collections. And very important for me to put all the biodiversity assessment and all biodiversity in a land use history context. Okay, because as I showed at the very beginning, and for this was the reason why I did it at the beginning, to emphasize that human impact is enormous, especially in the northern and central Andes. There is really a need to do the biodiversity assessment in an integrated way that takes into account the social aspects, the social cultural aspects, and do it in a manner as it was thought by Collins and collaborators, and they published it in 2011. Now the good news is that I reckon that Scott Collins's call is now falling on good ears in the Andes. There is a budding network of Andes-wide monitoring of environmental and ecological monitoring. And the groundwork for this partly has been established by a recent publication by Julieta Carrillo et al. I reckon that this is good times for the Andes in terms of biodiversity, mountain and alpine biodiversity in a social ecological context. Now, this is what I wanted to say. I thank you very much for your attention, and later I'll be open to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laszlo. Now you definitely set the stage for Fransisco, who will need to rush up and down the mountains with his talk, but I'm sure this will work out swiftly. So Fransisco, the stage is yours.
Is there any way that you can, Daphna, disconnect my, well, you already disconnected my presentation?
No, that was your own action.
Okay. Okay, I found it.
Now you did it. Okay. So Fransisco,
can you share my screen? Yeah. Can you see it?
Yes, thank you.
Well, so good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Fransisco Cuesta. I'll be talking today about high-ending ecosystems in an era of climate change. Wait. Yeah. So just to provide an example of the Andean sensitivity to climate change, this is just a publication of Matthias Wille et al. Related to the major massive glacier loss in the Andes over the last 60 years. So more or less what they said is that since 1970s, the Andes have lost between 20 and 50% of their mass. And this is clearly related to the surface air temperature anomalies recorded for the whole Andean range. So that explains the high exposition and the fast response of these systems to changes in temperatures. So also projections said by 2050, between 70 and 80% of that mass will be gone. And the problem is that the average glacier loss rate in the Andes, in the tropical particularly, is higher than the global annual rate loss. So that is creating huge, sorry, let me minimize this here. So there's a massive glacier loss that leads to strong ecosystems and landscape transformations. So this is an example of the Cordillera of Vilcanota, two locations in 2005, 2015. And as you can see, there's this dramatic changes on the landscape. And this translates into formation of new lakes and drying of existing ones, alteration of hydrological dynamics, which leads to community composition changes, especially to glacier-fed streams and wetlands. And of course, that also creates a good condition for upward shift of species and formation of novel or new communities in these deglaciated forefronts. And also, there's been suggestions of eventual loss of alpine biota over the years or through time. So this is more or less the setting the scene. So what we have done now, and that's what I want to talk today, is about two complementing approaches that we've been implementing since 2012. So it's actually a recent effort to try to understand how mountains in the Andes are responding to these changes. So one is the establishment of long-term ecological research sites, which is more or less what Laszlo talked about, but I want today to concentrate on the second one, which is the formation of this plot network, long-term permanent network that actually measures changes over time on specific mountains from Venezuela to Argentina. So this is just an example of how we're trying to study this. So there's more information here than the Gloria Andes itself. I just wanted to show it, as also Laszlo was presenting about mountain forests. So all the green dots are permanent plots where we are measuring over time changes in ecosystem responses in the last, let's say, 20 years. Which being the oldest in Argentina, and then all the red ones are the Gloria sites. Now this we have even the sites furthest in Argentina up to Patagonia. We'll present later. But the idea is that this integration of systems, the mountain forest and the alpine systems, can provide us an overview of long-term changes in these specific sites, and aggregating those, we can infer or try to discern trends in what is happening at different spatial and temporal scales. And we are specifically looking at vegetation, carbon dynamics, productivity, and biodiversity, looking not just at taxonomic, but also functional traits and so on. But this is a theme for another talk, I guess. So this is how the Gloria Andes looks like. So we have 19 sites, almost 20 actually, 74 summits clustered within those sites, 1,184 permanent plots of 1 square meters distributed around these 74 summits. We have also monitoring temperature at the soil level, minus 10 centimeters on the topsoil. So we have 264 data loggers that records a record per hour on a daily basis. So we have now a time series temperature more or less 12 years, which translates into 11 million records. Which I think is a huge thing because it covers many gaps in the temperature records and the climate records of mountains, especially in the Andes. We almost have no weather stations above 3,500 meters. So all these temperatures records are placed from the tree line, as Laszlo was talking about, up to the Nival belt. More or less, we have 1,491 taxa that's being monitored on these summits that translated to 41 families and 365 genera. There's 16 institutions involved in this effort, more or less 50 researchers. We have covered 7 countries. We were missing Chile until 3 years ago. And now we have completed the whole Andean change. And these 74 summits cover a temperature range of -5 to 15 degrees Celsius as the mean temperature of the condition of those summits. And we are covering a precipitation range of 250 to 3,800 millimeters of rain. So it covers broadly the major climatic zones of the Andean range. So this translates in this huge transect of 27 degrees latitude, more or less equaling 6,800 kilometers from north to south. And from the lowest summit to the highest summit, there's a huge range of 4,000, almost 5,000 meters of elevation gradient. And from east to west, 250 kilometers that has been covered by the setup of this transect, which constitutes up to date the longest alpine monitoring transit in the near tropics. So I will just provide you some information, specific bits of what we've been producing based on this setup. So this is the foundation of the Gloria Andes in terms of publications. We wanted to know how different or how similar those mountain summits are in terms of species composition. And surprisingly to us, especially to me, was that this looks like a textbook in which, as you can see here, all the sites are clustered following these well-documented biomes, but I would have expected that 80% of the community was changes among sites. So there's a huge difference, of course, dividing the Paramo and the Puna. In this case, we're just presenting the tropical section of the Andes. But it was surprisingly how different they are. So we were trying to understand what's going on, and we found out the annual precipitation that goes from north to south, and the temperature, the maximum temperature of the summit, of all the conditions of each of the summits, and the substrate type explain a lot the observed changes in the community composition. And then we also wanted to understand whether, and Laszlo was talking a bit about this, the Andean origin and the landscape, and the fragmentation of the landscape, and how these mountain summits and the final uplift in the last 5 million years ago relate to also to the Pleistocene climatic fluctuations. And apparently, what it says also that the continental insularity is a key factor in explaining this high level of species turnover. So the more isolated, the more endemic the species are, the more restricted they are. And no matter if you are really close to each other, but you have a barrier there of like a dry valley, the differences are quite high. So interestingly, to the first presentation today, that these broad patterns of distribution of plants is a conspicuous differences between the Arctic flora and the alpine flora in the tropical mountains of the Andes. Another important thing is that you were also talking about this, is the thermal amplitude, which increases away from the equator. So on a daily basis, we can have and this is based on daily temperatures. is that on the equator, we have more or less 10 degrees of variation on a daily basis, whereas as we move further south towards the southern tuna, that amplitude increases quite a lot. And that apparently is driving also the thermal niches or the thermal traits of those species. And that translates that the closer you are to the equator, those species tend to have a narrow niche, whereas that amplifies as we move further south. And that has implications in terms of the vertical distribution of the species, and also on the potential sensitivity of displacement under climate conditions, on new climate conditions, and the sensitivity of losing the rear edge of those distribution and where these species are located. And Laszlo was talking about these thermal belts. That's pretty much in line with that. So depending on which part of this thermal belt you are located, the more sensitive you become. And that's actually what we found here. So we use the thermal niches of those species, of all the species from the Gloria Andes network that are being monitored. So those that have a thermal optimum, a lower thermal optimum, and a narrow thermal niche breadth, which has all these red, green, and purple dots, which are these guys here, we projected the effect of 1 point Celsius increment by the end of the century. And those tend to be those that lost most the thermal niche space, especially the rear edge. So again, the thermal distribution, the vertical thermal distribution matters a lot, apparently. So this was just a hypothesis, right? Just a model. But then over the years, when we had more censuses across these plots, we were able to try to see whether there's a compositional shift. So in other words, if those guys that were identified as susceptible or more sensitive to climate change are actually responding to that. So first, this is just patterns of what is going on with the soil temperature over the summits, so across the Andes. So we found that 1/3, apparently that's not that much, that's not much, but from my understanding, it's a lot, show a significant increase in their thermal amplitude, which is the thermal maximas or temperature maximas are higher and thermal minimas are lower. So the amplitude, the daily amplitude is increasing consistently from Venezuela, from Merida to Tierra del Fuego in Patagonia. And so when we compare the data from the censuses, this is just a simple diagram of comparing species richness, vegetation cover. We found overall there's a net loss in vegetation cover, especially on the alpine and the lower belt, and an increase in species richness, right? Especially this is quite marked on the subnival summits of the Paramore, well, closer to the equator. And the thermal composition of the communities is also changing, especially the community breadth and the thermal score, so the minimum or the optimum of the score of the community. So that translates that progressively these communities are changing towards a dominance of species from the lower elevations, from the mountain forests and so on, that are expanding and colonizing the subnival and the nival belts. It's a slow process, but it's occurring, and this is just 5 years of differences between censuses. So just to summarize a bit, all this is that Andean summits are highly susceptible to climate change impacts, apparently. High community composition turnover increases species susceptibility to climate change impacts. So narrow range species or narrow endemic species tend to suffer most. Glacier loss leads to massive landscape transformation and is also creating a strong change in the landscape and the configuration of the ecosystems, not just plant ecosystem or terrestrial ecosystem, but particularly glacier-fed streams and wetlands. And then some are experiencing significant but heterogeneous change in soil temperatures. The species are migrating upwards, so most plant species experience shifts in their composition by including greater abundances of species with broader thermal niches and higher optima, which You already said that. And one thing that we're trying to understand now is whether this species ranges increase is permanent or is a transient event. Apparently, and if we look at the previous publication from the Alps, this seems to be a momentary moment or a lapse in time that eventually that will translate into a lot of local extinctions due to this extinction that what Brabham et al. Just coined it. And that's it, I think. Thank you. I have the pleasure of talking a lot of those people. I see that Ricardo Jaramillo is here. So, hola, Ricardo. Thank you for, I have the honor to talk about on behalf of all these people. And yeah, that's it.